In 1836, Texas declared its independence from Mexico, severing ties with the government in Mexico City after a long and bloody revolution. Many believed that this newly formed republic would be swiftly annexed by the United States, folding into its expanding territory like so many others before it. But the U.S., wary of provoking a war with Mexico, held back, at least for the time being. And so, for nearly a decade, Texas remained a fragile, sovereign nation, clinging to its hard-won independence while facing threats from all sides. Despite receiving formal recognition from powerful European nations such as France and the United Kingdom, as well as from the United States, the young republic found itself standing on shaky ground. Texas was not a land of prosperity or security. Rather, it was a land on the edge of collapse, a nation without wealth, without resources, and worst of all, without protection from the dangers that surrounded it. To the south, Mexico refused to acknowledge Texas as anything more than a rebellious province, and border skirmishes remained an ever-present reality. But the greatest, most immediate danger did not come from Mexico. It came from the north. There, across the vast, untamed frontier, the settlements of Texas faced relentless attacks from the most feared and formidable native warriors on the continent, the Comanche. The Comanche, known among themselves as the Numan, meaning the people, were not merely a tribe. They were a force of nature, a nation forged in the fires of war, a people whose mastery of horseback warfare was unmatched in all of North America. The name Comanche itself comes from the Ute language, meaning anyone who wants to fight me all the time, a name that, whether given in respect or in warning, could not have been more fitting. For years, the Comanche raided Texas without fear of consequence, striking deep into the heart of settlements, then vanishing into the plains before retaliation could even be mustered. They did not merely fight, they dominated. To the Texians, settlers who had only recently wrested their independence from Mexico, the Comanche were an unrelenting nightmare. They slaughtered men, leaving no survivors to tell the tale. They took livestock, crippling the economy and food supply of frontier towns. They captured women and children, assimilating them into their own society or trading them among distant tribes. To the Texians, these raids were an existential threat, more terrifying than the distant armies of Mexico ever could be. But from the perspective of the Comanche, this was not just war, it was survival. For centuries, their way of life had been defined by the great expanses of the southern plains. These were their lands, their hunting grounds, and their birthright. The arrival of Spanish colonists, Mexican authorities, and now Anglo settlers from the United States, all of them had disrupted the natural order, pushing further and further into lands that had once belonged to the people. To the Comanche, the settlers were not victims. They were intruders. The frontier was lawless, and the scattered communities of Texas could not stand against the Comanche alone. With their settlements under constant siege, Texians were left with no choice but to act. But how do you fight an enemy that moves faster than you, strikes harder than you, and disappears before you can even mount a defense? The answer came in the form of ranging companies. Groups of fighters assembled to patrol the frontier, hunt down raiding parties, and defend Texas from its enemies. These early bands of rangers were not a formal military force. They were fighters drawn from the very communities they sought to protect. Outlaws, farmers, former soldiers, men who knew that survival depended on their ability to outmatch the Comanche at their own game. Thus, the foundation of what would later become the legendary Texas Rangers was laid, not by strategy, but by necessity. Yet, despite their determination, these early Rangers were woefully unprepared for the war they were about to enter. The Comanche were not merely warriors, they were the undisputed masters of mounted combat. While the Texians were still dependent on slow-loading muskets, which took 30 to 60 seconds to reload, the Comanche could fire 20 arrows in the same amount of time, all while galloping at full speed. No Texian, no soldier, no ranger could match that. The Texians had made their move, but against the Comanche, it would not be enough. The settlers of Texas thought they had found a solution. With the constant raids from the Comanche, the Republic had formed ranging companies, men tasked with protecting the frontier from bandits, Mexican forces, and the native warriors who saw them as invaders. But these rangers, they were not the solution, at least not yet. The Comanche were not just another group of warriors. They were the undisputed masters of the horse, the fastest, most deadly riders on the Great Plains. They had spent generations perfecting their skill, moving like the wind across the land, striking their enemies before disappearing into the horizon. Against them stood the Texas Rangers, many of whom were young, inexperienced, and unprepared for the kind of warfare the Comanche had perfected. These Rangers could shoot, yes, but what good was a rifle that could fire only one slow shot when the Comanche could loose 20 arrows in the same time? The problem was not just the men, it was the weapons, the tactics, the very way the Rangers fought. To the settlers of Texas, the Comanche were an unstoppable force. While the Texans relied on muzzle-loading rifles, weapons that required 30 to 60 seconds to reload after every shot, the Comanche warriors could fire up to 20 arrows per minute, all while riding at full speed. Their bows were short, compact, and powerful, designed for mounted combat, where speed and precision mattered more than brute force. And the Rangers? They were trained to fight like European soldiers, standing their ground, aiming, firing, then reloading. That kind of battle might have worked against an enemy who stood in ranks and followed the rules of war. But the Comanche fought on their own terms. They attacked in waves, using feints and diversions to lure their enemies into the open. They never fought a battle they couldn't win. If the fight wasn't in their favor, they disappeared into the plains, waiting for a better opportunity. Time and time again, the Texas Rangers found themselves outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outclassed by warriors who had spent their whole lives in the saddle. It wasn't just the Rangers who were struggling. Texas itself was on the verge of becoming a failed state. Money was scarce. Resources were thin. Its settlements were under siege, not just from Mexico to the south, but from the Comanche to the north. Entire communities had been wiped off the map, and the government was running out of ways to stop it. If Texas couldn't find a way to fight back, there might not be a Texas at all. But then 2 men arrived, men who would turn the tide of history. One was Jack Coffee Hayes, perhaps the greatest Texas Ranger of them all. Unlike the others, Hayes was not just a soldier. He was a tactician, a leader, and a man who understood that the old ways of fighting were useless against the Comanche. The other was Samuel Colt, an inventor who had developed a new kind of weapon, one that could fire multiple rounds without needing to reload after every shot. Together, these 2 men were about to introduce a weapon and a strategy that would change the balance of power on the frontier forever. But was it too late? Stay tuned as we uncover how Hayes and Colt reshaped the fight against the Comanche, and how the Rangers learned to fight like the warriors they once feared. In 1817, a boy was born in Cedar Lick, Tennessee, a place far removed from the open plains of Texas, where the greatest battles of his life would be fought. His name was Jack Coffee Hayes, and he came from a family steeped in war. His father had fought in the War of 1812, a conflict that shaped American nationalism and cemented the legend of Andrew Jackson. His brother would later become a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. Hayes was raised in a world where war was not just a possibility, it was an expectation. So when the Republic of Texas called for men to settle its dangerous frontier in 1838, Hayes was among those who answered. But he didn't come as a soldier, at least not at first. Jack Coffee Hayes arrived in San Antonio, not with a rifle in his hands, but with a surveyor's tools. He was there to map out the land that the Republic of Texas was offering to settlers, land that had been home to the Comanche for generations. The way the settlers saw it, Texas was expanding. The way the Comanche saw it, Texas was stealing. The Panatec Comanche, the southernmost band of the known, were the first to respond. They did not sit idly by while surveyors carved up their homeland. To them, these men were invaders, not warriors, but thieves who had come to divide and take what was not theirs. And so they killed them. In 1838, more than half of the surveyors sent into Comanche territory never came back. The ones who did return had learned a brutal lesson. This land was not unclaimed, and it would not be taken without blood. Yet somehow Hayes not only survived but thrived. That same year, he surveyed 76 headrights, an astonishing number given the dangers of the job. But he did more than just map out land. He fought for his survival, and unlike most surveyors, he did not just run when the Comanche came for him. The frontier was full of men who had faced Comanche war parties, and lived to tell the tale. But Jack Coffee Hayes was different. Most surveyors and settlers, when faced with an attack, would run for cover. They would fire a shot, then retreat, hoping the Comanche would lose interest. Not Hayes. Hayes stood his ground. He was not content with just surviving. He was there to fight, and fight he did. Time and time again, when war parties raided, he met them in battle, and against all odds, he won. This wasn't just luck. Hayes understood something that most Texans did not. The Comanche did not respect weakness. A man who fled was a man already defeated. A man who stood his ground, who refused to run, who fought even when outnumbered. That was a man worth fearing. And so the Comanche learned to fear Hayes. Wherever he was, there was a cost to attacking. This was a man who was not easy prey. This was a man who was becoming something else. It did not take long for the Texas Rangers to hear about Hayes. They were looking for men who could do more than shoot straight. They needed men who could lead, men who could survive, men who understood the way of war on the plains. And Hayes, he was already proving himself in battle before he even joined their ranks. The Comanche had taught him how to fight. The only question was, what would he do with that knowledge? Stay tuned as we uncover how Jack Coffee Hayes became the most feared Texas Ranger of his time, and how he turned the tide against the Comanche. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Texas Rangers were not yet the legendary force they would later become. They were young, inexperienced, and largely unprepared for the war they were fighting. Most Rangers were barely in their 20s, eager to make a name for themselves, but lacking the skills needed to survive against the most fearsome warriors of the Great Plains, the Comanche. Among them was a young man named Jack Coffee Hayes. At just 20 years old, he joined the Rangers, unaware that he was about to witness one of their greatest failures, a battle that would expose everything wrong with the way Texas fought against the Comanche. This was the 1839 expedition led by Colonel John H. Moore, a mission meant to punish the Comanche for their raids. Instead, it became a lesson in how not to fight the people of the plains. The Texas Rangers had been around since 1823, first formed by Stephen F. Austin to protect settlers from raids. But by the time Texas became an independent republic in 1836, the Rangers were still not an organized army. They were more like a loose band of fighters, signing up for short enlistments that lasted 3 to 6 months. They were poorly paid, sometimes not paid at all, and they lacked the resources of a real military. But for the people of Texas, the Rangers were still their best hope because the alternative was worse. To live in fear of raids that could come at any time, from any direction. It was clear something had to be done. So in 1839, Colonel John H. Moore led 63 Rangers and 16 Panama scouts into Comanche lands. Their mission? Find a village, attack it, and send a message that Texas would not tolerate more raids. What happened instead was a disaster. The Rangers and their allies found a Comanche village unguarded at night. With the advantage of surprise, they moved in to attack. But they made one critical mistake. They failed to take the Comanche horses. In the confusion of the attack, the Comanche warriors escaped and stampeded the Texan horses, leaving Moore's men stranded and vulnerable. The Rangers had rifles that could shoot at long range, but they were slow to reload, taking 30 to 60 seconds per shot. The Comanche, they could fire 20 arrows per minute, all while riding at full speed. The moment the Comanche warriors regrouped and mounted their counterattack, the battle was over. The Rangers tried to retreat to a cedar break, hoping to hold the line and force the Comanche to give up. Eventually, the Comanche did withdraw, but by then, the battle had already exposed a painful truth. The Comanche's way of war was too fast, too mobile, and too effective for the Texas Rangers to fight using traditional tactics. Jack Coffee Hayes watched as the Rangers struggled to reload, while the Comanche rained down arrows with ease. He saw how fighting on foot was a death sentence when facing warriors who could close the distance before a second shot could even be fired. And in that moment, he realized something. If the Texas Rangers kept fighting this way, they would never win. The Comanche didn't fight like European armies, lining up in formation. They moved in fast, struck hard, and disappeared before their enemies could respond. The Rangers had to adapt or be destroyed. That lesson, learned in the chaos of a disastrous expedition, would shape Hayes' entire future. But could one man really change how the Rangers fought? Could he find a way to match the speed and power of the Comanche? The answer lay in a new way of fighting and a new weapon that would change everything. Stay tuned as we uncover how Jack Coffee Hayes transformed the Texas Rangers and the battles that would redefine the war for the frontier. In 1814, 3 years before Jack Coffee Hayes was born, another man entered the world, one whose invention would alter the balance of power on the frontier. His name was Samuel Colt, and though he never set foot on a battlefield, his creation would shape the way wars were fought. Colt's early years were filled with loss and hardship. His mother died of tuberculosis before he turned 7, and he would go on to lose all 3 of his sisters. In the face of grief, he found solace in pyrotechnics and explosives, an unusual coping mechanism that would eventually spark his obsession with weapons. By the time he was 22 years old, Colt had developed something that had never been seen before. A firearm that could fire multiple rounds without needing to be reloaded immediately. In an era when even the most advanced muskets and rifles took 30 to 60 seconds to reload, this was nothing short of revolutionary. But would it work? Would the world be ready for such a weapon? In the early 19th century, guns were frustratingly slow. Even the best-trained soldier needed half a minute to reload a single-shot musket or rifle. In a battle, that was an eternity, especially against warriors who could fire 20 arrows a minute while riding at full speed. Some inventors had tried to solve this problem before Colt. They had created pepperbox guns and volley weapons, but these were unreliable, heavy, and dangerous to use. Many were prone to misfires, and some could even explode in the user's hands. Colt wanted something different. He envisioned a weapon that was light, practical, and, most importantly, fast. In 1836, Samuel Colt patented his first design, the Colt Paterson revolver. This was the first true revolver, featuring a 5-shot, 36 caliber rotating cylinder. With this, a man could fire 5 times before needing to reload, a huge advantage over single-shot weapons. But there was a problem. The stopping power was weak. The .46 caliber bullets didn't have enough force to take down an enemy with one shot. Worse still, once the 5 shots were fired, reloading was painfully slow. Users had to remove the entire cylinder just to reload, making it useless in prolonged combat. Colt's first design was a commercial failure. Almost no one bought it. It was seen as fragile, impractical, and untrustworthy, except for one place, Texas. In 1839, President Mirabeau B. Lamar of the Republic of Texas ordered 180 Colt revolvers for the Texas Navy, but they never saw action at sea. The Texas Navy was soon disbanded, and the revolvers were left sitting in storage. It seemed that Colt's invention was destined to be forgotten. Until, that is, they made their way onto the plains of Texas, where they would soon prove their worth in the bloodiest battles of the frontier. But would they be enough to change the war against the Comanche? By 1843, Jack Coffee Hayes was just 26 years old, but his name was already known across Texas. He had survived the deadly frontier for years, fighting alongside the Texas Rangers and working as a surveyor, a job that put him directly in harm's way. Despite the humiliating failure of John H. Moore's 1839 expedition, Hayes had earned a reputation as the finest Indian fighter in the region, not because he simply killed Comanche warriors, but because he did something few others dared to do. He studied them. Unlike most rangers who relied on outdated military strategies, Hayes understood that fighting the Comanche required more than just courage. It required adaptation. He had seen what happened to those who underestimated the people of the plains, and he refused to make the same mistake. So when Hayes was promoted to captain of the Texas Rangers in San Antonio, he had one goal: change everything. For years, Texas Rangers were little more than loosely organized fighters, left to fend for themselves with no official support. They had to buy their own weapons, supply their own ammunition, and even provide their own horses. If they were killed, another man would take their place. The government barely paid them, and even when it did, it was a small amount. The result? A force that was outgunned, underfunded, and constantly outmaneuvered by the Comanche. Hayes saw this as a death sentence, so he changed the rules. First, he secured funding from the Texas government. Rangers would no longer have to buy their own gunpowder and ammunition. These would now be provided by the state. In some cases, Rangers would even receive a stipend for supplies and food, making them more like a professional force than a ragtag militia. Second, he raised the standards for joining the Rangers. No longer could just anyone sign up. Hayes only accepted men who were expert riders, because against the Comanche, being slow meant being dead. He refused to take anyone whose horse was worth less than $100. Why? Because in the world of mounted warfare, the horse was just as important as the man riding it. The Comanche Mustang was perhaps the fastest horse on the continent in short-distance sprints, and no amount of skill could save a ranger if his mount was too slow. Hayes knew that if his men couldn't match the Comanche in speed, they were already defeated. Third, he abandoned outdated European tactics. Rangers no longer formed lines and fired volleys like traditional soldiers. They no longer fought only from a defensive position. Instead, they adopted the Comanche's own guerrilla warfare tactics. Travel light, strike fast, retreat before the enemy could regroup. These weren't just small adjustments. They were a revolution in how Texas Rangers operated. But even with these improvements, there was still one thing missing: a weapon that could match the speed and firepower of the Comanche bow. Hayes had no way of knowing that soon a single firearm would change everything. By 1844, Jack Coffee Hayes and his Rangers had adapted, evolving their tactics to mirror those of the Comanche. They no longer fought like European soldiers, relying on rigid formations and slow-loading rifles. Instead, they rode hard, struck fast, and retreated before the enemy could regroup. But even with these improvements, the Rangers still had one glaring weakness: their weapons could not match the speed of the Comanche bow. That was about to change. Somewhere along the way, perhaps by the orders of Samuel Houston, the former president of Texas, Hayes and his men had acquired Colt Paterson revolvers. These guns were unlike anything the frontier had seen before. Instead of firing a single shot and scrambling to reload, a Ranger could now fire 5 consecutive rounds before needing to reload. For the first time, they had a weapon that could fire as fast as a Comanche archer. But there was one problem. No one knew if the revolvers would work in real combat. That summer, they would find out. By May 1844, the frontier was on fire. Comanche war parties were raiding settlements, striking small towns, burning homes, and disappearing back into the vastness of Comancheria before anyone could retaliate. Hayes and his 15 Rangers set out to find them. For 3 weeks they searched. Nothing. The Comanche, as always, fought on their own terms. Then, northwest of San Antonio, the Rangers stopped to rest. While they were gathering honey from a beehive, one of the men spotted something on the horizon. A line of over 20 mounted Comanche stood atop a nearby hill, watching. One of the Rangers, John Coleman, shouted, "Indians!" Immediately, Hayes ordered his men to mount up and take position on a nearby slope. They were outnumbered, but they were Rangers. They welcomed a fight. Hayes, always aggressive, ordered a charge. The Rangers galloped toward the Comanche, expecting them to scatter, but as they closed in, something felt off. The warriors did not move. Hayes had seen enough battles to know what this meant. It was a trap. As the Rangers reached 60 yards, cresting the hill, they saw them. 2 additional lines of mounted Comanche emerged from behind the terrain, at least 75 warriors in total. Hayes was no stranger to bad odds, but this was suicide. He immediately ordered a halt and signaled for his men to retreat to a nearby tree line where they could use cover. This was exactly what the Comanche had been waiting for. As the Rangers turned their horses, the warriors unleashed their war whoops and charged. The Rangers barely had time to react before arrows rained down from the sky. The Comanche Mustangs, the fastest short-distance horses on the plains, closed the gap. More warriors moved to flank Hayes's men, trying to cut off their escape. The Rangers had one hope: make it to the trees before they were overrun. Would they survive? The battle began as it always did, with the Comanche circling their prey. On horseback, they moved like the wind, darting in and out of range, loosing arrows with deadly precision, then disappearing before their enemies could react. They were not an army that stood in lines. They were not soldiers who fought by European rules. They were warriors, masters of movement and deception. From behind their buffalo hide shields, they advanced and retreated in perfect coordination. When a warrior fell, his brothers swept in to retrieve his body, ensuring the enemy never counted their dead. The Texas Rangers knew this strategy well. They had seen it before, and they knew exactly what the Comanche were waiting for. The Rangers had rifles, long range and deadly, but the Comanche also knew their weakness. A rifle took time to reload, too much time, so the warriors bided their time, their arrows flying through the air, their horses moving effortlessly beneath them. They knew that soon the Rangers' gunfire would slow, that soon their enemy would be vulnerable. But today something was different, because when the rifle fire began to fade, the Rangers did not hesitate. Instead of fumbling for powder and shot, they drew their Colt revolvers. The sound of battle changed in an instant. No longer was there the usual pause, the moment of silence as a man struggled to reload his rifle under fire. Instead, there was continuous gunfire. The Colt revolver was unlike anything the Comanche had ever faced. Rangers could fire 5 shots in succession, and the warriors who had trained for the gaps between gunfire suddenly found there were none. Several Comanche were shot out of their saddles before they had time to react. For the first time, the Rangers had a weapon that matched the speed of a Comanche bow. But there was a problem. At this distance, Colt's revolvers were not accurate. The Rangers fired, but the warriors kept moving, adapting, circling just out of range. They had faced firearms before. They had seen new weapons come and go, and they had never been conquered. Jack Coffee Hayes saw the battle shifting. His Rangers were still outnumbered, 15 men against 75 Comanche. The warriors were regrouping, preparing for another attack. Hayes had one chance. He ordered his men to charge. Galloping through a shower of arrows, the Rangers tried to break the Comanche lines. 3 of his men were struck immediately, falling from their saddles. Others turned back to protect them, breaking the momentum of the attack. Samuel Walker, one of Hayes's Rangers, a man whose name would later be etched into history alongside the Colt revolver, was impaled by a Comanche lance. Hayes had no choice. He signaled the retreat. With 5 Rangers wounded, they fell back to the tree line, struggling to pull arrows from their bodies while the Comanche surrounded them. And as Hayes looked down, he saw the future of war resting in his hands, his Colt revolvers. Each Ranger had 2 of them, with preloaded cylinders, giving each man up to 20 rounds before needing to reload. A Comanche warrior could fire 20 arrows per minute, but now, for the first time, the Rangers could match them shot for shot. And so, in an act of sheer defiance, Hayes made a choice no Comanche war chief would ever expect. He ordered his men to charge again. 7 Rangers rode from the tree line. The Comanche had assumed they were beaten, but now, as they turned their attention to their wounded and fallen, the Rangers came at them once more. The warriors were caught off guard. Hayes and his men fired their revolvers in rapid succession, not accurate at long range, but devastating up close. A wave of panic rippled through the Comanche ranks. For years, they had fought men who needed time to reload. For years, they had controlled the battlefield with their speed. But now the enemy did not pause. Now the enemy did not stop firing. For the first time in the history of the frontier, the Comanche warriors turned and ran. Hayes and his Rangers pursued them for 2 miles, their Colts still cracking through the air. Every time the warriors tried to turn and fight, another Comanche fell to the endless gunfire. It was a moment of confusion, a battle unlike anything the Comanche had ever seen. But then the gunfire stopped. The Rangers had run out of ammunition, and the Comanche realized it. Silence spread across the battlefield. The illusion of an unstoppable weapon had been broken. And the war between the Comanche and the Texas Rangers was far from over. The Comanche warriors had fought as they always had, swift, unrelenting, and fearless. Even as their numbers dwindled, they did not scatter. They did not surrender. Instead, their chief, standing among the 30 warriors who remained, turned to face the Rangers. His people would not run. They would fight to the last man if necessary. Jack Coffee Hayes and his Rangers had defied the odds, but now they faced a new challenge. They were nearly out of ammunition. Hayes called out, desperate, "Does anyone have rounds left?" Only one man answered, Robert Gillespie. Gillespie dismounted, lifted his rifle, and took careful aim. The Comanche chief was 30 yards away, close enough for one final shot. And he took it. The bullet struck true. The chief fell from his horse, and in that instant, the battle changed. To the Comanche, a leader was more than just a warrior. He was their medicine, their spiritual shield. With his death, that protection was broken. For the first time, the warriors hesitated, and in the next breath, they scattered. The Rangers had won, but it had been a bloodbath. Casualties at Walker's Creek. Of the 75 Comanche warriors, between 20 and 50 were killed or wounded. Of the 15 Rangers, 8 were wounded, 4 seriously, and only 1 was killed. The Comanche had never seen a fight like this before. Never had they suffered such a devastating loss to a group so small. And yet, it wasn't just the casualties that shocked them. It was the weapon. Years later, Comanche warriors would describe this battle with a phrase that perfectly captured the shift in warfare. The Rangers had a shot for every finger on the hand. For the first time, their legendary speed, their greatest weapon, had been matched. Back in the East, Samuel Colt heard about what had happened in Texas. His invention, the Colt Paterson revolver, had proven itself in real combat. It had kept Hayes and his men alive, allowing them to fight on even terms with the Comanche for the first time. Colt reached out to Jack Coffee Hayes, hoping to learn more about the battle, but instead he found another ranger, Samuel Walker. Walker had fought in the battle firsthand, and he had ideas on how to improve the revolver. Colt was an inventor. Walker was a warrior. Together, they would build something even more powerful. With Walker's experience and Colt's engineering, they designed a new weapon, one that would correct the flaws of the original Colt Paterson. 6 shots instead of 5, larger caliber for greater stopping power, stronger, more durable frame. It became the most powerful handgun in the world at the time. Texas immediately ordered 1,000 Colt Walker revolvers for the Rangers at $25 each, a massive investment, equivalent to $800 today. But the Rangers weren't just fighting the Comanche anymore. War with Mexico was on the horizon, and this revolver would be needed for both enemies. Jack Coffee Hayes, Samuel Walker, Samuel Colt, 3 men whose names would forever be linked to the battle that changed the frontier. But the biggest shift wasn't in names, it was in power. For decades, the Comanche had been the undisputed rulers of the plains. Their warriors, their horses, their bows, no army could match them. But that changed at Walker's Creek. For the first time, the Comanche were not the fastest on the battlefield. For the first time, they were not the only ones who could strike without pause. This was not the end of the Comanche, not yet, but it was the beginning of something different. And in the years to come, as the Texas Rangers rode across the plains, one phrase would echo. A phrase that summed up what Samuel Colt had done to the balance of power in the West. God did not make every man equal, Samuel Colt did.